The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface deceptively calm under the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942. Commander Joseph Rockford hunched over his desk at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, his bloodshot eyes scanning the decoded Japanese transmissions. That would soon change the course of World War II. The enemy was coming to Midway, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, America would be ready. Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the intelligence reports that had taken months to decipher. The Japanese combined fleet, led by the formidable Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was steaming toward the tiny coral atoll of Midway with overwhelming force for aircraft carriers. 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers comprised the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled. Their objective was clear: eliminate the remaining American Pacific Fleet and force the United States into negotiations. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his secret codes had been broken. Every message, every strategic decision, every tactical maneuver had been intercepted and decoded by American cryptographers working around the clock in basement rooms across Hawaii. The element of surprise, Japan's greatest weapon since Pearl Harbor, now belonged to America. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles as mechanics performed final checks on his Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bomber. Around him, the flight deck of the USS Enterprise buzzed with controlled chaos as aircrews prepared for what everyone knew would be a decisive battle. The American force was dramatically outnumbered. Only 3 operational aircraft carriers compared to Japan's 4, and barely 110 aircraft against the enemy's 248. Yet morale remained high. This time, they knew the enemy was coming. On Midway itself, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon watched his radar operators track incoming aircraft formations. The island's defenses had been hastily reinforced with every available fighter plane, anti-aircraft gun, and fortification that could be scraped together from across the Pacific. 6,000 Marines and Navy personnel would defend the strategic airstrip that served as America's westernmost outpost in the Central Pacific. As the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon gold, radar operators on Midway detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as 26 Marine fighters scrambled to meet them. The Battle of Midway had begun, though the decisive action would unfold not on the coral runways below, but on the vast blue battlefield of the Pacific, where carrier task forces maneuvered like chess pieces in a game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of the Pacific War. The trap was set, the players in position, and history held its breath as the greatest naval battle of the Pacific War commenced in the waters around a speck of coral that most Americans had never heard of, but would never forget. The roar of aircraft engines shattered the morning calm as 108 Japanese planes swept toward Midway Island like a deadly swarm. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the first attack wave from the carrier Hiryu, his Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers escorted by 36 Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies since the war began. Below them, the emerald waters concealed the positions of 3 American carrier task forces, invisible to Japanese reconnaissance but poised to strike. On Midway, Marine Captain Marion Carl pushed his Wildcat fighter to maximum throttle as he climbed to intercept the incoming formation. The American fighters were outmatched. Their Wildcats and Buffaloes were slower and less maneuverable than the legendary Zeros, but the Marines had something their opponents lacked. They were fighting over their own base, with nowhere to retreat. As the formations clashed at 8,000 feet, the sky erupted in a deadly ballet of machine gun fire and exploding aircraft. The Japanese attack was devastating, but not decisive. Tominaga's bombers struck the airfield, fuel storage tanks, and defensive positions with precision. But the critical runway remained operational. More importantly for the larger battle, Tominaga radioed back to Admiral Chuichi Nagumo on the flagship Akagi that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize Midway's defenses completely. This single message would prove to be Japan's fatal mistake. According to historical analysis from the Naval War College's comprehensive study Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, published in 2005, Nagumo faced an impossible decision that morning: whether to prepare his reserve aircraft for a second strike on Midway or to arm them with torpedoes for anti-ship attacks against American carriers that might be lurking nearby. Admiral Nagumo chose the island target. In the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, armament crews frantically began switching torpedoes for bombs, a time-consuming process that would leave the Japanese carriers vulnerable at the critical moment. The admiral had no way of knowing that American reconnaissance planes had already spotted his fleet, or that 3 American carrier task forces were racing toward attack positions. Meanwhile, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise made his own crucial decision. Despite being over 100 miles from the Japanese fleet, at the extreme range of his aircraft, he ordered an immediate strike. The American planes would have barely enough fuel to reach their targets and return, but waiting would only allow the enemy to complete their rearming process and potentially discover the American position. At 7:32 in the morning, the Enterprise began launching aircraft. Within an hour, 116 American planes were airborne, flying toward what they hoped would be a rendezvous with destiny. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, took the most direct route toward the Japanese fleet. These 15 obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers would soon write their names in history, with their own blood, buying precious time for their dive bomber colleagues with the ultimate sacrifice. The stage was set for the most decisive air-sea battle in naval history, where the fate of nations would be determined by the courage of young men flying fragile aircraft. Across the vast Pacific, Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron adjusted his compass heading and checked his watch. As Torpedo Squadron 8 droned westward across the empty Pacific, behind him, 14 other Devastator torpedo bombers followed in loose formation, each carrying a single Mark 13 torpedo and 3 crew members who knew they were flying toward almost certain death. The obsolete Devastators were slow, cumbersome, and virtually defenseless against modern fighters, but they were all the American Navy had. Waldron had spent the previous evening writing letters home, including a prophetic note to his wife: "If we don't come back, you'll know we went down fighting." His mixed Sioux heritage had taught him to face danger with stoic courage, and he would need every ounce of that strength. In the next hour, the squadron had become separated from their fighter escort and dive bomber companions during the long flight to the Japanese fleet, leaving them to attack alone against impossible odds. At 9:20 in the morning, Waldron spotted smoke on the horizon. The Japanese carrier force was directly ahead. Admiral Nagumo's for carriers steamed in a protective diamond formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns. As the American torpedo planes approached, the sky filled with black puffs of flak and the deadly shapes of Zero fighters diving to intercept. The attack that followed became known as one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in American naval history. The Zeros tore through the slow-moving Devastators like wolves among sheep. Machine gun bullets shattered cockpit glass, punctured fuel tanks, and ignited aircraft engines. One by one, the American planes tumbled from the sky in flames or crashed into the churning Pacific. Ensign George Gay's aircraft took multiple hits as he pressed his attack on the carrier Soryu. His gunner, Robert Huntington, slumped over dead in the rear cockpit, and his radio man lay motionless. Gay himself took a bullet through the leg, but continued his torpedo run despite the Zero fighters swarming around him like angry hornets. At 800 yards from the target, he released his torpedo and pulled up sharply, only to have his crippled Devastator immediately shot down by pursuing fighters. Gay survived the crash and spent the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, hidden under a seat cushion while the entire Battle of Midway raged around him. He became the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's attack, watching helplessly as all 14 of his squadron mates perished in the morning sea. Not a single torpedo found its target, yet their sacrifice would prove crucial to American victory. The courageous but futile attacks by all 3 American torpedo squadrons, Torpedo 8 from Hornet, Torpedo 6 from Enterprise, and Torpedo 3 from Yorktown, had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. Zero fighters that should have been positioned at altitude to intercept incoming dive bombers were instead chasing the low-flying torpedo planes, burning fuel and ammunition in the deadly melee just above the waves. As the last Devastator disappeared beneath the Pacific swells, the Japanese carriers turned to recover their fighters and launch a counter-strike against the American fleet. In the hangar decks below, armament crews rushed to complete the switch from land attack bombs to armor-piercing torpedoes, leaving fuel lines open and ordnance scattered across the decks. The stage was set for the most devastating 10 minutes in the history of naval aviation. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered through his cockpit windscreen at the empty ocean below. His Enterprise dive bombers had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours. fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return. Behind him, 37 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers followed in a loose V formation, their crews scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy carriers that intelligence had promised would be here. McCluskey made a command decision that would alter the course of World War II. Instead of turning back toward Enterprise, he followed a lone Japanese destroyer that was racing northward at flank speed. His pilot's instinct told him the destroyer was heading towards something important, possibly the main Japanese fleet. It was a gamble with the lives of his entire squadron, but McCluskey had learned to trust his instincts during 20 years of naval aviation. The gamble paid off spectacularly. At 10:24, McCluskey's radio crackled with the electrifying call. Enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 12 miles. Spread out below them in diamond formation were all for Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, exactly where American intelligence had predicted they would be. Even more incredible, the carriers were at their most vulnerable moment, with fuel lines open, bombs and torpedoes scattered across their hangar decks, and their fighter cover drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks. McCluskey didn't hesitate. Attack immediately, he radioed to his squadron, then pushed his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the flagship Akagi. The Japanese lookouts had been focused on the sea-level torpedo attacks and failed to spot the American dive bombers until it was too late. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but the steep diving angle made the American planes nearly impossible targets. At that same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown in a coordinated attack on the carrier Soryu. The timing was perfect. 3 American dive bomber squadrons hitting 3 Japanese carriers simultaneously, catching them with their combat air patrol out of position and their decks crowded with armed aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction that turned the flagship into an inferno within minutes. Admiral Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara as his one-sprout carrier became a floating funeral pyre. The explosion detonated stored torpedoes and aviation fuel, creating a massive fireball that could be seen 20 miles away within minutes. Kaga was dead in the water, her flight deck buckled and her hangar bays raging with uncontrollable fires. Soryu suffered a similar fate as Yorktown's dive bombers found their mark. 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned the 3rd Japanese carrier into a blazing wreck. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto chose to go down with his ship, tying himself to the bridge as his crew abandoned the doomed vessel. In just 10 minutes, the Japanese Navy had lost 3 of its fleet carriers and most of their experienced aircrews. The ships that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor were reduced to burning hulks, their aircraft and pilots consumed in the flames of their own fuel and ordnance. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, and Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific War died with their carriers in the deep blue waters. Around Midway, as smoke billowed from 3 burning Japanese carriers, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The morning's dive bombing attacks had exceeded his wildest expectations, but the battle was far from over. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained operational and dangerous, her aircraft already launching a counter-strike against the American fleet. More ominously, Spruance's ships had revealed their position and could expect the full fury of Japanese retaliation. Within hours, Captain Elliot Buckmaster paced the bridge of USS Yorktown as his damage control teams worked frantically to repair battle damage from the Coral Sea engagement just 1 month earlier. The carrier had limped into Pearl Harbor with a massive hole in her flight deck, damage that Navy engineers estimated would take 3 months to repair. Instead, 1,400 shipyard workers had swarmed over Yorktown for 72 hours straight, patching her wounds with steel plates and determination. She was still not fully combat ready, but she was here, and that would have to be enough. At 11:58, Yorktown's radar detected incoming aircraft, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters from Hiryu, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. The Japanese pilots were among the most experienced in the Imperial Navy, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. They had watched their own carriers burn that morning and were hungry for revenge. The American combat air patrol rose to meet them. Wildcats climbed for altitude as the Japanese formation approached from the southwest. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch led the fighter defense, employing the innovative Thatch weave tactic he had developed to counter the Zero's superior maneuverability. The weaving pattern allowed American pilots to cover each other's blind spots and brought multiple guns to bear on attacking Japanese fighters. Despite the fierce fighter defense, several Japanese dive bombers broke through to attack Yorktown. The first bomb struck the flight deck near the island, sending shrapnel sifting through the superstructure and knocking out several boilers. The second bomb penetrated deeper into the ship, exploding in the hangar bay and starting serious fires. Captain Buckmaster ordered damage control parties to fight the fires, while his engineering crews worked to restore power to the ship's vital systems. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was back to 20 knots and recovering aircraft, a testament to American damage control techniques and the determination of her crew. The Japanese pilots who survived the attack reported sinking a large American carrier, but Yorktown refused to die. The respite was brief. At 2:45 in the afternoon, radar detected a second strike from Hiryu. 10K torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway Island. Tominaga's own aircraft had been damaged in that earlier strike, but he chose to lead this crucial mission despite knowing his fuel would not allow him to return to his carrier. The torpedo attack was expertly executed, despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition. The Japanese pilots pressed home their attack with suicidal courage. The torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and knocking out all power. The carrier took on a severe list and came to a dead stop, apparently finished. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, Yorktown's crew abandoned ship at 3 in the afternoon, believing their carrier was doomed. Captain Buckmaster was among the last to leave, ensuring that classified materials were destroyed and that wounded sailors were safely evacuated. As he stepped into a life raft, smoke and flames poured from his once proud ship, and it seemed certain that Yorktown would join the 3 Japanese carriers. On the bottom of the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, watching the coded messages pour in from the battle area. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed, but at a terrible cost. Yorktown apparently sinking and American aircraft losses mounting. The battle hung in the balance. With 1 Japanese carrier still operational and the Imperial Navy surface forces intact and dangerous, the next few hours would determine whether Midway represented American victory or merely delayed defeat. 200 miles northwest of Midway, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard the carrier Hiryu faced his own moment of decision. As the only surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu bore the weight of salvaging something from the disaster that had befallen the combined fleet. Yamaguchi was considered one of the most aggressive and capable admirals in the Imperial Navy, a man who had advocated for immediate follow-up strikes after Pearl Harbor. Now he had one chance to turn defeat into victory. At 4:30 in the afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise and 14 from the hastily repaired Yorktown launched for what everyone knew would be the decisive strike of the battle. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, despite having lost his bomb in the morning attack, guided his pilots toward the last Japanese carrier. The American formation climbed steadily westward, knowing they were flying toward the most dangerous target in the Pacific, a fully operational enemy carrier with nothing left to lose. Hiryu's lookout spotted the incoming Americans at 5:15, but Admiral Yamaguchi's ship had few fighters left for defense. Most of his Zeros had been shot down during the morning attacks or were low on fuel. After hours of combat, the carrier's anti-aircraft gunners would have to stop this attack alone, their lives and their ship's survival depending on the accuracy of their fire. The American dive bombers approached in textbook formation, splitting into 2 groups to attack from different angles and divide the defensive fire. Gallagher led his section against Hiryu's starboard side, while Leslie's planes dove from the port quarter. 0 fighters rose to meet them, but there were too few to stop the coordinated assault. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, who had scored the fatal hit on Akagi that morning, selected Hiryu's flight deck as his target. His 1,000-pound bomb struck just forward of the carrier's island, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among fueled and armed aircraft. The blast triggered secondary explosions that raced through the ship like wildfire, turning Hiryu into the same kind of inferno that had consumed her 3 sister carriers. Within minutes, Hiryu was dead in the water. Her flight deck collapsed and her hangar bays blazing with uncontrollable fires. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard his flagship, sending a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. Hiryu listing to starboard and on fire. We are preparing to abandon ship. The last Japanese aircraft carrier at Midway would join Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu on the bottom of the Pacific by dawn. As darkness fell on June 4, 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had been transformed. Japan had lost for irreplaceable fleet carriers, and most of their experienced aircrew, pilots who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered by American courage, superior intelligence, and a healthy dose of luck. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato far from the battle area, ordered a general withdrawal. The Japanese advance across the Pacific had been stopped cold by a handful of American carriers, and the brave men who flew from their decks. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, though scattered fighting would continue for several more days. America had won its first great victory of the Pacific War, but the cost had been enormous, and one final tragedy remained to be played out in the waters. Around a battered carrier named Yorktown, dawn on June 5, 1942, revealed a transformed Pacific battlefield. For Japanese aircraft carriers lay on the ocean floor, their twisted hulks carrying with them the dreams of Japanese expansion and the irreplaceable aircrews who had dominated Pacific skies. Since Pearl Harbor, the strategic balance of naval power had shifted irrevocably in America's favor, but the Battle of Midway was not yet finished. The crippled Yorktown still floated, her abandoned hulk listing heavily, but refusing to sink. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, observing from a nearby destroyer, made the difficult decision to reboard his ship with a skeleton crew of volunteers. If Yorktown could be saved, she would provide invaluable service in the long war ahead. Damage control parties returned to fight the fires, and counterflood compartments to correct her list, while tugboats steamed from Pearl Harbor to assist in the salvage operation. For 36 hours, it appeared that American determination might save the battered carrier. Salvage crews made remarkable progress, extinguishing fires and stabilizing the ship's condition. Yorktown's list decreased from 26 degrees to just 2 degrees, and her structural integrity seemed sound despite the torpedo damage. Naval architects began planning the complex tow operation that would bring her home to fight another day. Lieutenant Commander John Tanabe aboard the Japanese submarine I-168 had been stalking American ships since the battle began, but the high-speed maneuvering of the carrier task forces had prevented him from achieving attack position. Now, with Yorktown dead in the water and protected only by a small escort, Tanabe finally had his chance. Dawn on June 6th, he spotted the salvage operation and began his approach. The destroyer USS Hammond was tied alongside Yorktown, providing power and pumping services to the salvage crews. Her sonar operators detected the approaching submarine, but the complex geometry of the two ships prevented effective evasive maneuvers. At 1:36 in the afternoon, Tanabe fired for torpedoes at point-blank range, scoring hits on both the destroyer and the carrier. Hammond broke in half and sank within minutes, taking 81 American sailors with her to the bottom. The explosion of her depth charges, set to safe depth but detonated by the sinking destroyer, killed many swimmers in the water and further damaged Yorktown's already weakened hull. The carrier's salvage crews were forced to abandon ship for the second time, as their vessel took on an increasingly severe list. At 5 in the morning on June 7th, Yorktown finally succumbed to her wounds. The Fighting Lady rolled over and disappeared beneath the Pacific swells, taking with her the hopes of immediate salvage, but leaving behind a legacy of courage that would inspire the American Navy. For generations, she had absorbed punishment that would have sunk lesser vessels, fought to the end, and given American dive bombers the platform they needed to achieve victory at Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz surveyed the battle's aftermath from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, tallying the costs and consequences of America's first great naval victory. Japanese losses were catastrophic. For fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 sailors and airmen killed. Among the dead were many of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots, men whose training and combat experience could not be replaced in the remaining years of war. American losses were significant but sustainable: 1 fleet carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 personnel killed. More importantly, the 3 remaining American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the soon-to-be-repaired Saratoga, now faced a Japanese carrier force reduced to just 2 operational fleet carriers in the entire Pacific. The Battle of Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan's offensive capability had been broken, her naval aviation corps decimated, and her strategic initiative lost forever. From this point forward, American industrial might would tip the balance increasingly in favor of the Allied cause. New carriers, trained pilots, and improved aircraft would pour from American factories and training schools, while Japan struggled to replace her losses with inferior equipment and hastily trained crews. As the sun set on June 7, 1942, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The desperate defensive actions of the first 6 months gave way to American offensive operations that would carry the war westward island by island, battle by battle, until Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. The young men who had flown obsolete aircraft against impossible odds at Midway had changed the course of history, proving that courage and determination could overcome superior numbers and advanced technology. Their sacrifice at a tiny coral atoll in the Central Pacific had saved not just American interests in the Pacific, but the cause of freedom itself.